I think early childhood education and why I am also really drawn to it and have stuck in it for a little over 15 years now is, I mean, this is my second job ever.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I've never had any other job.
Wait, what was your first job?
I worked at the Linwood Target.
No way.
Women's lingerie.
Oh,
I think when I look back at it now, they were messing with me and just like kept assigning me to
They
that.
put you there.
Yeah.
Hey guys, welcome to the Untapped Potential Podcast. Today we have Nick Terrones. Nick Terrones is an early childhood educator, a published author, and also one of our good friends. Today he joins us to talk about his life, how he got into early childhood education, and to discuss his new book, Can of Worms. Nick, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
So I'm going to just jump right into it, man. Early childhood education, what is it and what made you go into it?
Oh, yeah. Well, early childhood education is, I mean, I think the name implies it, right? Like it's education for young children, but I think we have to also dissect what does education mean. And so I think in early childhood, the educational sort of part, quote unquote, if you will, is getting children to find their own modes of learning, of who they are as a learner, to learn, to love to learn, to cultivate a sense of lifelong learning, and then underneath of all that, all the important social emotional skills, right? How do you deal with adversity when it's like just put at you? How do you regulate your own emotions? And it's this is a lifelong process though, and so in early childhood education, we start building those foundations of. This is how you can deal with something when you're feeling frustrated, sad, over excited, over happy. Yeah, so that's where I would say how I would define early childhood education. And I got into it. Well, I've always wanted to be a teacher. It was either that or a garbage man when I was like 5 years old.
One of the two.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know what it is. You know, like I think like most young boys like want to drive around a big truck and lift heavy things. Yeah. And, you know, I always knew that I threw away good trash, and like, you know, one person's trash is another person's treasure. And sometimes I would find other people's trash as my own treasure. And so I was like, you know, garbage is kind of cool. Or recyclables and whatnot. And I was always into like using cardboard and paper towel tubes to like build things or whatever. And so I kind of, as I think about going throughout my scholastic years, elementary years, when I reflect back on it now as an adult, I just always had this infatuation with the dynamic between teacher and student. And I've always, not to say I was the most successful at school, but I enjoyed being at school. And I know that's not the case for a lot of people. And as I got older, I never really wavered away from wanting to be a teacher. And I never wavered from wanting to be away from school. Mm-hmm. You know, and I was thinking about this on the way here, much like a lot of martial arts, like you get to your black belt, and then once you go past the black belt, you essentially become full circle and you go right back into a white belt. And that's where I feel like I'm at now. Whereas, okay, I went to college, got my specific degree in early childhood education, and now I'm right back into preschool. You know, I'm just starting right over again. And that's why I try to tell kids I've never left school. Like school has always been something that I've just enjoyed. And I think it's because of the relationship piece, seeing people grow, seeing how I can help people grow, and in ways that are just very subtle and just being with each other in relationship. But I guess more specifically, I know I kind of went off on a more philosophical tangent there. At Wazoo, we all, you know, where all of us went in this room, go Cougs.
Go Cougs.
I went to study elementary education. So I wanted to teach kindergarten. But I fell in love with human development and specifically early childhood education. And I, at that time in 2002, 2003, my freshman year, I didn't realize people were taking preschool seriously. I didn't know that there was a whole science around it, that there was about 200 years of like developmental research and theorizing happening. And I was just kind of hooked. And I think when I look back at it now, I was always attracted to social sciences.
Right. And I know right now, I'm not an expert on the field by any means, but I've heard a lot about how they're trying to expand like the public school system to include like pre-K. Talk about that. Like, what's the standard right now, and where is it that we want to go, and why?
I have my own, I guess, personal issues with that. I think early childhood education, and why I am also really drawn to it and have stuck in it for a little over 15 years now, is, I mean, this is my second job ever.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I've never had any other job.
Wait, what was your first job?
I worked at the Linwood Target.
No way.
Women's lingerie.
Oh,
I think when I look back at it now, they were messing with me and just like kept assigning me to.
They put you there.
Yeah. Or I guess I could say, I was a work study student at the Wazoo Office of Financial Aid. But,
gotcha. Yeah.
That's not really a job.
That's not really a job. Let's be honest.
Doing homework.
Yeah.
Yeah. You get paid to do homework there.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. And I, went right out of college and just jumped right into it and have just kind of done this.
Wow, man.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, so just knowing how focused you were in going down that path, you must have had some sort of experience really early on, maybe with a teacher that kind of led you to make that decision, or like before you even went to college, I'm assuming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is that experience for you?
I think I'm gonna answer Max's question first. So I take a little bit of issue with the public school trying to absorb early childhood education in a sense. There's a saying going on right now that preschool is the new kindergarten. And I think that's very unfortunate, because what we do know about kindergarten and public school systems is, and maybe you've heard this, but there's a lot of buzzwords these days, right? And one of them is like school readiness. Well, what the hell does it mean to be school ready? A lot of us might conjure up ideas of like reading, writing, arithmetic, right? But we always push down the social emotional skills. We always push down the cognitive, the mental health of children, the mental health of the teachers. And when the mental health of the teachers, public and in early childhood education, gets bombarded with standardized testing, particular what I call for-profit curriculums, you're adding layers of stress. And when you're adding layers of stress to something that is so crucial to our society, which has been super apparent these past year and a half with coronavirus, we see that even early childhood educators are the backbone of the economy, I would say. You're putting all these layers of stress for little pay. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And we all it's not like everybody knows that teachers are minimally paid. And I've always come back to like everything that is the backbone of society is doesn't get what it deserves. Police, nurses, food service workers, grocery store workers, custodial workers, educators. And that's why you have educators who spend minimal times in the classroom and keep pursuing more and more degrees, but because they have to like pay off their student loans.
And the only way to do that is to get more education and to get those certificates.
Right. And one thing I wanted to chat with you guys about was we're never encouraged to prioritize our happiness. People look at me and they're like, and I think this is unfortunate. They're like, that's so great that you're a man and how you look, that you're working with young children and that you've dedicated your life to that. That's so great and special. To me, that's just like, no, that's a severe lacking of people prioritizing their actual joy and what they want to do. Mm-hmm. And like I was telling Money Mitch over there when I met up with him a few weeks ago, we live in this day and age of where I would say it's like this age of side hustle. And, you know, even with you guys doing this podcast, you're doing this because this is your joy. This is something you're finding a lot of like great value and happiness in, but no one was ever going to actually encourage you to do that as a main priority. Right. Because there's our society, and especially within education, it's like, nope, here's the sort of like where you need to be successful, making that money.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than actually prioritizing what is joy in our life. What do I actually want to do? And I mean, I could say I got into early childhood for the money, right? But we know that that's not true. I mean, I started making right out of college $13 an hour, which was like,
and this is back when, for those that don't know,
2006.
2006.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that
minimum wage around there was probably like $7-8.
Yeah, so it was still a little bit better, and it's in Seattle, so you know, pays a little bit better.
Right.
Cost of living was, you know, again, I would say it was still about the same of like where it's at in terms of the ratio. But I, you know, I stuck with it, and there were like my book and whatnot, and my podcast Napcast, who I do with my colleague and friend Mike Brown, is our side hustle, but it's still attached to our overall goal, right? Whereas maybe this podcast for you all isn't quite attached to what you do for a 9 to 5.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for people who are just listening to us on audio and maybe not watching, you mentioned about how like the way you look and the area that you work in, people like you aren't too common. Could you describe a little bit? You know, you got some tattoos.
Yeah. So, I mean, I got like, my right arm is sleeved. I'm working on my left arm, like I was telling you guys. Some people say I'm racially ambiguous. Am I Mexican? Am I Native? Am I Filipino? Am I Pacific Islander? Yes, to all of those. Yes, I'm a little bit of all of that.
You're a melting pot of just cultural.
Whatever the Spaniards touched,
Yeah.
I'm a product of. And you know, I'm a cisgendered heterosexual male who works with young children, and 13 out of my 15 years working with infants and toddlers. So, you know, yeah, that's.
And where you work at, how common is that? How many other like, you know, cisgender males is there?
Well, we're so I just moved into a new position. So now I'm a director of a preschool, and
nice.
so I moved out of the teaching realm. But fortunately, my school is small enough that like I still get a chance to like get into the classroom and practice that teaching muscle and being with kids and whatnot, because it is quite straining on my spirit to just be behind a desk and having to do paperwork a lot,
or to like give somebody shifts,
and figure out shifts, and
Yeah.
if somebody calls out, and especially now figuring out what is.
But in this field, there's not a lot of you. There's not a lot of Nicks, or even just male cisgendered educators.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot. There's a slight increase. I think the last stat that I saw, it's and this is globally, maybe like 0.3%.
Wow.
On a global.
That makes sense though, because looking back at my own education, I think I had like one male teacher in everything before middle school. I think middle school is when I started seeing more male teachers, and even more in high school.
That's
but
true.
when you're talking like elementary school, all women, all my teachers were women. I went to like a daycare center, like a migrant like daycare
Othello,
center
right?
in Othello. Yeah, and all the teachers there were women. I don't think there was one male. So
and even in early childhood, and again going back to just the stigma of education for men, again, and that's the thing of society. It's like keep moving up in the ladder, keep doing this. Whereas for our other gender counterparts, it's like, no, stay where you're at. And and then answering your question, Chris, where you go by Vegas in this?
Either way, anything for you, Nick.
His evil alter ego.
Maybe a couple more of these, I'll turn into Vegas.
Okay.
That's good.
I would say my early experiences were, you know, I was shuffled around between care, in-home daycare, and like kinder care, you know, the corporate child care place that's still around now. My I mean, wherever my mom could afford to take me. And I mean, I don't have a whole lot of memories of, not many of us do, because our brain just can't really hold on to those unless you're like super genius or something. But there must have been something positive that happened. And one of the other things, though, I would say on a more negative experience was my young brother, when he was about 3 years old, was physically abused in preschool.
Oh, wow.
So like, when I look
By an
back
educator?
when I look back at it now, I think that was one of the big catalysts where I'm like, I'm remaining in this field, like because of that, of seeing that experience. And I was like 10 years old at the time. There's a 6-7 year age difference between him and I. But, he was being a child. He was being a defiant 3-year-old. And, a lot of people say like terrible twos. No, it's the threes, man.
Really?
It's the real one.
Is that pretty consistent with any generation? Is like 3 years old? They're pretty freaking crazy.
Yeah, because, two, like, I think where the terrible two stereotype comes out of is more of like when they're aging out of being 2 years old and becoming 3. Because when they're 3, they're way more autonomous. They're way more verbal. They're going to tell you what they think, and they're going to bring up things. They're going to call you out on your bullshit. And you're just like, wait, how are you out logicking me right now? And it's very like, very consistent, and they're very persistent. And I would say that toddler age range, what I loved about it, it does, like we were talking about, Max, it encapsulates the human spirit a lot. And it encapsulates a lot of who the potential or the untapped potential of what a human being can be. And young children in those age ranges really show that. And so my brother was being, and again, when you pile on like whatever's going on physiologically, biologically, in terms of your sex, because there's in my book, there's a difference between sex and gender.
Right.
So
can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that's an important theme that you bring up. And also define cisgendered as well. Yeah,
so cisgender would be, I'm still learning about this stuff. I know, and by no means consider myself an expert, but I am willing to have the conversation and dedicate myself to learning more about these things, and to try to have conversations like this to get people thinking about it. So cisgender would be and I don't even know what cis stands for or what its a short or its elongated name is, but cisgender would be just you confirm and live your life according to the gender that you were assigned to.
At birth, right?
At birth, yeah.
Gotcha.
Got it.
And so there's the anatomical sex that we're born with, our genitalia that we're born with.
Okay.
Now, right from the get-go, doctors slap on a gender. Now, to me, that gender is influenced by traits that society has sort of constructed into, because our brains want to classify things. We want to know what belongs where, so that way we know how to deal with it. And for the things that we don't, and the things that are kind of ambiguous and vague, we generally put walls up around, right? And we have issues with. So those traits that I would describe, that I would describe that are attributed to gender after your sex is identified, or what you have between your legs, is what we call masculinity and femininity, right? But both of those traits we all have in some way or another. And the way, and some have more than the other, or some have less and whatnot. And I would also liken that to the yin and the yang of Chinese Eastern way of thinking, right? The hard and the soft, the yin and the yang, the
yin, the circle thing. Yeah.
The balance of life, right?
Yeah, we'll put it up on the screen right now.
Exactly. Yeah, the balance of life.
Yeah.
And so, and oftentimes those inner workings, even in our Western society and thinking, they play with one another and they intermix. And so, but especially our Western society and where we're at today wants it to be very pigeonholed, very much in a box. So even like what I do for a job would be considered more in that feminine realm.
Sure.
Right?
Just because historically you're saying 99.7% globally of educators are women.
Right. And then when we think about why is that? Because particular societies, and I would say just more of Western society has put people into that. Like, this is what you do. This is your job. This is what you do. This is what your job. And we can take that and put that that framework on class, race, all these other things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to jump onto that too. That's a good segue because you actually talk a little bit about race and class in your book and how it's important to talk about these topics to kids when they're, really young, like preschool age.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So in the book, it's more about how do we find our ourself as as grown-ups with children.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to say, I have been trying to differentiate, like we're just grown humans because they're humans as well. But we put, kids and adults in this like hierarchical like thing. But if we can all be more childlike, then I think the world would be way better because children are naturally curious and they're not necessarily judging. They look to us as adults to know what to judge as something safe or not. And that's where our task as grown humans, we need to embrace difficult conversations that children bring up. So like in my book, I started off, the first sentence is like, does the worm have a penis?
A kid asked you that?
Yeah. And
That's crazy.
it's the, this 2-year-old who like
Right.
just within the last 6 months learned to put their thoughts into words.
Yeah.
And so they're like gonna say some shit.
I guess tell me a little bit more about like that dilemma that you've gone through in this book, and I mean how that's influenced you over the years as an educator.
Yeah, you should show the book too, by the way. I don't think we've shown it. It's pretty cool.
Can of Worms by Nick Terrones. But yeah, go ahead and talk about it.
Yeah, and I would say, I like to describe the book as it's like toddlers and children, that it's short and sweet and impactful.
Yeah. Couple pictures in here.
Yeah. And it's it's about like finding your own space of like, are you self-reflecting enough? I think the world needs more self-reflection, and all us grown humans need a little bit more self-reflection. Like, why am I thinking or saying this thing? Where does that come from? Why do I feel like I have to describe it this way? And it's so that dilemma came through because it happens in the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing I've been latching onto, it's like better to say the wrong thing than to say nothing at all. Because if you say the wrong thing, you can always come back and rectify the issue, which I do in the book. Like, hey, yeah, well, what I know is like boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. Hold up. And then like maybe an hour and a half later after nap time, I tell the young girl, I'm like, hold up. What I told you earlier about boys having penises and girls having vaginas isn't totally true. Like,
Right.
you can have that and feel a different way on the inside kind of thing. And trying to think about how do you distill down this big idea to someone, again, who just learned to talk 6 months ago and who's like taking in all kinds of information.
Right.
And that's the thing too, I think is very important these days to have these hard conversations with children, because information is being bombarded at them at a faster pace than it was for either of us in this room.
Absolutely.
Right.
100%.
Like, and so if we're going to be putting them in front of this wave tsunami, even of information, we need to show them how to keep afloat within it, how to make sense of it.
Right.
Otherwise, if we don't, then the natural thing to do is just to kind of succumb to all the information and latch on to what you think is right. And that's confirmation bias right there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Would you say the key is just to be honest with kids and talk to them how you would any other adult?
Exactly.
Rather than like filtering it through like this like goo goo gaga like space.
Yeah, goo goo gaga talk is good. And I think research shows like up to like about 10, 11 months. After that, you got to start talking to them
Normally.
Yeah.
And what's the reason that people keep doing that? Does it make them feel more secure about like not giving them too much information about the world?
I think it's one of the concepts that comes out of the realm of teaching that I'm ingrained in, reggio emilia, it's like you've heard Montessori, maybe Waldorf.
I don't. I haven't. No.
So
What
these
is
are it's a form of a pedagogy, like a philosophy in teaching.
Gotcha.
Oh, I see.
And so I've been entrenched in reggio emilia, which is pretty open ended, which is why I really love it. But one of the big tenets of reggio emilia teaching is the image of the child. How do you see them is how you're going to view them. Now, just take that and apply that to anything else, right? Like, how do you see someone who's Black? Like, what's your image of them without even having experiences with them? Is then how it's going to be how you treat them. And so that's where a big part of self-reflection comes in. I think with what you were asking, Chris, it's important for us to have these, and I think you were asking too, Max, is it's okay to model uncertainty. I think that's the biggest thing that that I would want people to take away from my book. It's okay to say, like, I don't know, and like, let's find out together. Because we've experienced adults who like think they know, and they put on this facade like they know, and then it starts building up this other image of how you see them, because you're like, wait a minute, this person's full of shit.
Right. You get older and you kind of lose trust in people because you're like,
they've been lying to me this whole time.
Yeah, it's like this person's been a lie. It's a facade that he or she has been putting on for me.
Right.
And it's like you start to question everything at that point.
Right. And they lose that credibility. Right. And so children have this as well.
Oh yeah.
Have parents pushed back to you and said, no, I'm not gonna do that because, what's their reasoning?
I don't back away from like hard conversations, and again, it's about before you have hard conversations, and sometimes this happens simultaneously, it's about building relationship, right? There's so much power in relationship.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Like where I'm at now and what I've been able to do is not because of me. It's because of the general we. It's because, I've made a note to say this. It's not about what you know, it's about what you're willing to learn. And especially, what are you willing to learn from other people? And when you can create a strong foundation of trust, especially with families and their young children who are particularly vulnerable in a lot of ways, then we can start diving deep into why are you putting up the blockade? And so with what it had always come down to with families is that they themselves just didn't have the experience, right? And so that's kind of the reason why I'm sort of writing this book. And like, when I first took on this task of writing a book, I was like, oh, it has to be like so thick. A legit book has to be this big. It's like, actually, no. And a lot of people have been like, I love that you can be so impactful in such a small read, that like it gives you enough frame of thinking without being so over diluted and over worded with things, and that it's rooted in stories and relationship. But yeah, it's generally, it's always come down to the family's own lack of experience with having these conversations. And that's a generational thing. Like sweep it under the rug, keep it going. And in some sense, I see that as I would liken that to a bit of like emotional trauma, because you're not being able to process your own questions. You're not being able to process the observations that you see of the diverse landscape of humanism.
Right. What are, you've had a lot of experience studying this stuff. You wrote a whole book on it and you work directly with children. What are some like do's of like child raising and child teaching, and some don'ts that kind of just come to mind right off the top? Maybe like a top 2, top 3 for each.
I always, it depends on your cultural context.
Yeah. Just like a general, if there's anything you can generalize.
Do let children play.
Yeah.
Don't sit them behind a desk and expect them to.
Is that a real
ABCs.
Problem with parents? Like,
yeah.
And
for some families, yeah.
And so they don't like let them play with other kids and anything like that.
So
that's crazy.
And that's the thing is like research is showing, and more emerging research is showing that social emotional learning and social emotional skills can't necessarily be taught. They have to be experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have to make our faults. We have to have mistakes, but we also need people around us to help guide us of like, yeah, that sucked. And you failed at that. I mean, there's plenty of time, so many times. And even now that I still stumble and fall with that. But again, it's that saying of like, yeah, you stumble and fall, but you get back up. But a lot of the times when it comes to social emotional learning, we need people to help us get up. And that's what children need. So I think a lot of times our adult expectations is above what a child is actually developmentally able to do. So I would say reasonable expectations, let them play. Those would be the do's. The don'ts would be the opposite of that. Like, don't expect them to be quote unquote school ready just because they can identify their ABCs. Don't call your kid smart just because. That's one thing like I always hear is like, oh, my kid's so smart, or their kid's so smart. It's like,
they're 2 years old and they
what
know their
the
ABCs.
hell does that mean? Yeah. Or they can identify things. No, you've taught them to be a parrot. You know, you've taught them to be a monkey of like, hey, monkey, do this dance and I'll give you a treat. I'll give you a reward. Where it's like, brain science, like being done out of the UW even, that I've helped like do some consulting with, shows that a child is actually not ready for all that stuff until they're 8 years old.
Wow.
Like the brain does this like huge weird dump of information, and then it's ready and primed, and the neurons and the synapses are ready to fire for that more specific information. But before that, so if you think about that 8 years of life, what the hell are we doing with it? 8 years, man. Like,
honestly, I don't feel like I gained consciousness until I was like 5 years old, like straight up.
Right, like one day in like kindergarten or like first grade, you just like came to life.
Just like, wait,
you got these headphones on, listening to like a book, and you're like, "What am I doing here?"
You start
look
getting
down and fuck, man, I have a penis. Does a worm have one?
Yeah, exactly.
Ask your teacher, "Hey, hold up, she's teaching like 2 + 2. Hey, does a worm have a penis?"
Yeah.
But so now you've been teaching for like 12 years, right? Or longer than that?
I would 14 like actual teaching, and then this last year in a director role.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've experienced at least 2 different generations of children at this point.
I did the math, yeah, like it's about like 250 children. My first batch of kids, they're starting college, or they're like in their first couple months of college now.
No way.
Yeah. It was
That's crazy.
It was a trip to like be driving in Ballard, and I hear this honk, and I'm like, hey, like all the kids, like they still call me Nicky. It's just like, hey, Nicky. And I look over, and one of my like kids who's now in college drove themselves down to college, was like, hey. I'm like, what the hell are you doing driving?
It's like, you haven't aged a day.
That's crazy though, because you were teaching them when they were like really small, right? Like 3 or 4 years old, maybe, if that. And they remember you from that time.
Yeah. Well, so what I was going to go with that question is like, what have you seen are the biggest differences between the generations of children?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. The kids, especially in the last 8 years, have had a more bombardment of societal trauma, right? I mean, we have the and it's interesting because there was some article that I was reading about like people our age, like we're the generation of trauma. You know, we even, I mean, I'm older than you guys, I think significantly. I'm 37. You guys are barely like 30.
26.
You're 26. Yeah,
I'm 30.
Yeah. So I grew up, and I grew up in the Rodney King riots and the race riots in Los Angeles. I went through the giant earthquake in Los Angeles. African bees were going to come and kill us, right? And all of this sounds still familiar because we're still having it today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, which tells me is like, hey, if something keeps repeating itself, then there's obviously something that needs to change. And a lot of our children now are witnessing the actual steps of change happening, right? And when you have, for better or worse, social media platforms that can spread information and or misinformation, then they're having to decipher that and having to filter that. And so I think that the generations today, like again, from 8 years ago to now, are seeing agents of change, and they're seeing they're seeing the anger of people a lot more. Whereas I think for us and before that 8 years, it was limited because technology was limited.
Mm-hmm.
But all of us did also experience 9/11, for example,
Right.
and then all the repercussions of that. And so, there's I would say that the process of trauma and the societal trauma is and the way that has been conveyed and dealt with is different for the generations.
So as an educator for young children, what's kind of like an overall piece that you would recommend for parents to do that would make just early childhood educators' jobs easier?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing that popped in my head is be an advocate.
Yeah.
Write letters to your legislators. Like at my old school, we would do yearly letter writing campaigns and just try to get like hundreds of letters to our legislators advocating for higher wages, advocating for better work hours for families. Again, I think what we can do now, because we got to think about what's within our control and what's within our influence. There's not a whole lot that's like immediately within our control.
Right.
There's a hell of a lot within our influence. And part of that is actually taking that time and sending out some letters to your legislators, to the lawmakers, voicing your opinion about things. And especially for the rights of a family, for the rights of the child, for the rights of a parent. And really, I think partnering in that advocacy with your childcare center. And if they don't have something going on like that already, encourage them, take those baby steps of like saying, hey, I'll be a parent volunteer and, or caregiver volunteer. And I'll help rally the other families in the center so we can pursue this. So I think for me, it's more about like doing, and I'm thinking about it on a larger scale. Being an advocate, but then also I think on a more practical, real-time sense, is have some empathy for each other, have some empathy and compassion that like your educators are underpaid, overworked, and undervalued, and that a lot of the times early childhood centers are just surviving. So think about how we can move them from surviving to thriving, because there's not a whole lot that are thriving right now.
Right. So it sounds like parents could take more of a leadership role in their child's education and be more involved, like you said, writing letters and just understanding and being there for the educators too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to flip over to the screen now and
Cool.
just wanted to show a couple of pictures from the book here. Again, Nick's book, Can of Worms, you can buy it on Amazon, sort of Barnes & Noble.
No, not yet.
Not yet?
Not yet, but
Man.
you can go to, I think it's on there. Let's see.
Yeah, there you go.
Exchangepress.com, and then in the search bar you put in Can of Worms.
And on the screen here, we're just showing a couple of the pictures from the book here. Some drawings that some of the children drew about the worms in the can.
Yeah, so I asked them, what does a can of worms look like to you? Draw me some can of worms.
Man, as a kid who was not artistic, that just triggers me, because I remember when they'd ask me to draw stuff, I'd be like, oh man, it has to be perfect. And now I look back and I'm like, dude, they just wanted me to draw what my imagination showed.
How old is the kid that drew that?
So these kids were actually, these weren't preschoolers. These were like school-aged kids.
Okay, I was gonna say
I was gonna say for a 2 or 3 year old, I was
No,
like,
yeah.
man, that's freaking sophisticated.
Next Picasso.
Yeah. So no, they
Let me zoom in there.
those two girls that did it, they were kindergarten and like, I don't know, second grade. But these kids that I asked, I had them as preschoolers at one point, or as toddlers before. And then actually the kid on the left, I asked him to draw a picture as well.
Oh.
Yeah, because he was still at the center at the time.
Well, so you can find Nick's book, Can of Worms, on Amazon. Make sure you check the link in the description for that.
And
Nick,
Exchange Press.
Exchange Press as well.
Yeah.
Nick, thank you so much for coming through on the show
thanks,
today.
Nick.
Yeah, thank you.
And guys, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We post videos every Wednesday, so make sure to check those out. And follow us on Instagram.
And TikTok.
And TikTok. We got TikTok now. But yeah, thank you guys. Till next time.